Are synthesizers becoming more user-friendly? I'd like to ask you 3 questions because I'd really value your thoughts and opinions on the subject. I've been thinking about this for, well, probably a good few years, and I shall tell you why. We'll get to the questions a little bit later in the video, if that's okay with you. Now, to put things into perspective, and for anyone who wasn't around in the 1970s or 80s or even the 1990s, in days of yore when synthesizers were analog and men were, well, able to program them, essentially they were 1 knob per function. And if you knew a little bit about synthesis, they were fairly easy to use. You could quite easily create your own sounds, have a lot of fun in the process, and make some great music with them. In the 1980s, we got the digital synthesizer, and we loved these because they created such a vast, different range of sounds that we had never heard before. The downside was we couldn't program the things. So most people ended up just using the presets. The most famous and possibly anecdotal example of this is Yamaha's DX7. According to Yamaha, 99% of the DX7s which had to be returned to the factory for repair of one sort or another contained the original presets and not one original new sound. So we had gone from a bunch of sliders and knobs we could use to program sounds to a tiny little display and a data slider. Now, although we did love and appreciate digital synthesizers, I think most musicians really wanted more hands-on control. And that was really difficult with digital synthesizers because, well, essentially digital synthesizers are software synthesizers in a dedicated hardware enclosure. In software, you can do anything. And as there were so many options available in a digital synthesizer, it was frankly impossible to put controls for every single one of them on the control panel. However, recognizing the fact that you can't put every single control on the front panel and saying, oh, well, we'll just give them one, seems to be a slight overreaction. However, the desire to get back to a synthesizer design which gave us more hands-on control was building, I think, throughout the 90s and right up until present day. Now, over the last 20 years or so, I'm sure you will be aware that there has been a massive amount of interest in so-called vintage instruments. Now, I just have to go on a slight tangent here, and I really don't mean to be controversial, but I just have to say what I think. People who like vintage synthesizers often say it's because of the warm analog sound. Now, my contentious statement, if you like, is that now, given the state of digital software technology, I'm going to say that you really can't tell the difference. Now, this isn't just my opinion. I made a video about it, about one aspect of it anyway. If you want to check that out, card up there, link in the description. Now, if you think nothing sounds or can sound like a vintage analog synthesizer, that is totally fine. I'm not trying to persuade you otherwise. I'm simply pointing into tests which other YouTubers have done, asking if people can tell the difference, and generally the answer is no, they can't. So getting back to vintage synthesizers, apart from the sound, I can see why people like using them because they were so hands-on. So I sort of think that the interest in these instruments was not just for the sound, but because they were so usable and playable. So coming up to date, I thought over the last few years we were about to see a resurgence of this sort of 1 knob per function in synthesizer design. The Moog Grandmother, which was released in 2018, is 1 knob per function. It is one of my favourite synths, and you can probably see it sitting in the corner over there. This was followed by the Moog Matriarch, which was more of the same. Now, even Roland, who, if I may say so, is renowned for including menus and submenus and sub-submenus in most of its instruments, try to be a little bit more friendly and hands-on. I mean, even back in 1991, they released the JD 800. This was a digital synthesizer, but look at the design. Even now it looks super cool and super futuristic. And this was a reaction to the digital synths of the day, even Roland's own digital synthesizers, which had little displays and 1 or 2 controls for editing. More recently, Roland released the System 8, and what's cool about this is that you can plug in, or plug out as they call it, different digital synthesizers. It has a lot of hands-on controls, and if you swap synthesizers, then only those controls which affect that particular synthesizer will light up. So it's very friendly in that sense. I know some people don't like the green display. I think it looks cool and a little bit mad scientist. And coming more up to date, Roland's Jupiter X had a panel layout which was very reminiscent of the original Jupiter. Then they released the Juno X, which also had a panel very reminiscent of the Juno. Now, although you did have the hands-on controls, this only took you so far if you want to explore the full depths of these instruments, and you really have to dive into the menus to get to some of the functions. There's a reasonable size display on the Jupiter. I'm a little surprised that the display on the Juno is so small. Roland isn't renowned for its generosity, shall we say, in this area. But perhaps we can agree that they are trying. So if we're talking about usability in synth design, there are 2 more I would like to mention. The first is, well, it's actually 3. It's Korg's Trilogy, the Wave State, the Mod Wave, and the Op6. These are all essentially software instruments, as has been proven when Korg released software versions of them. The surprise is why it took so long, but they are essentially software synths with dedicated hardware controllers. And these dedicated controls on the actual synthesizers do make the synths a lot more user-friendly. Having said that, because they are digital synthesizers, they have a big LCD display. And really, to get the most out of these instruments, you really have to dive into the menu. So it's a little bit of give and take. The other synth we have to mention is the Udo Super 6, which famously does not have a display at all. It is packed full of knobs, sliders and buttons. It is, if you look at it, reminiscent of early Roland synthesizers, but it is a deceptively powerful instrument. However, due to the lack of a display, you do need to push 2 buttons to access certain parameters. Again, a trade-off. So, question time. Question number 1. Do you think over the last few years synthesizers have become more user-friendly, easier to program? Now, compared to the digital synthesizers of the 80s and 90s, the answer is absolutely yes. But coming more up to date over the last 10 or maybe even 15 years, do you think synth design has been more user-friendly? I was thinking we might be seeing a resurgence of usability in a synth design. I'm not totally sure. What do you think? So the second question is, where do you stand on menu diving? Now, I know many people don't have a problem with it. They are quite happy to dive into menus to access parameters and so on. Now, I think it's fine for global settings and the like, settings that you aren't going to use every day. But if you have to continually dive into menus to access parameters to program a synthesizer, I think it takes the fun out of it. It takes the immediacy out of it. And speaking personally, I rapidly lose the will to program. So, question 3, and I'm really interested in the answer to this one. What do you think is the most user-friendly, easy to program synthesizer? It may be one that you have, it may be one that you've tried in a store, you may just have seen videos about it. For me, it has to be the Moog Grandmother, or possibly the Matriarch, 1 knob per function. If you know how subtractive synthesis works, then you are off flying straight away. What would your choice be? As we move forward, and hopefully the chip shortage and component shortages are easing, I am really hoping that we're going to see more user-friendly, usable, easy to program synthesizers arriving on the market. But we'll see. So I hope you found this interesting, perhaps a little thought-provoking. If you have enjoyed this video, then I think you might enjoy these videos as well. See you again soon.